On April 15th, 2019, Paris witnessed a horrifying scene as flames erupted across the roof of Notre-Dame Cathedral, sending towering columns of black smoke swirling around one of France's most sacred symbols. Within just a few hours, the fire consumed the centuries-old timber roof, brought the iconic spire crashing down, and pushed Notre-Dame to the brink of disappearing from history. Yet even after the disaster, Notre-Dame remained standing on the edge of collapse. What did France do to stabilize this nearly 900-year-old stone structure in the heart of Paris? And how could engineers revive a masterpiece that had almost been erased by fire and time? Today, join Mandarin Tech as we step inside the extraordinary journey to restore Notre-Dame Cathedral after that devastating blaze. Located on Ile de la Cité, the ancient island in the middle of the Seine River, Notre-Dame Cathedral stands as a landmark inseparable from the history of the French capital. Known as Notre-Dame de Paris, meaning Our Lady of Paris, the cathedral was built to honor the Virgin Mary and became one of the finest masterpieces of French Gothic architecture. Its soaring vaults, stained glass windows, stone towers, and external flying buttresses transformed it into a symbol of faith, art, and medieval engineering. But after the fire in 2019, that legacy faced an unprecedented challenge. The restoration was therefore not merely the repair of a historic monument, but a journey to save the form, memory, and soul of Notre Dame. When the last flames were finally extinguished, Notre Dame no longer resembled the familiar image once printed on Parisian postcards. Above, the massive timber framework known as La Forêt had been completely consumed, leaving behind a cold, empty void. Below, stone, ash, firefighting water, and fallen fragments of material formed a chaotic scene where every step could touch a piece of history that had just been destroyed by fire. Yet the two western bell towers were still standing. Many of the main walls had not collapsed. Some of the stained glass windows, statues, paintings, and religious artifacts escaped direct destruction. Experts had to examine every section of wall and every block of stone to determine which areas could be approached, which had to be sealed off, and which parts risked pulling the entire structure into another collapse. From that moment, Notre Dame was no longer an untouchable symbol, but a fragile heritage site that had narrowly escaped destruction, waiting for humanity to reclaim it piece by piece from the ruins. Immediately after the disaster, the area around Notre Dame was sealed off as a strictly controlled safety zone. No one could enter it as they would an ordinary construction site, because above their heads were thousands of tons of ancient stone that had just endured thermal shock, vibrations, and pressure from the firefighting operation. The engineers began by surveying the entire cathedral and monitoring every change in its structure. Sensors were installed to record tilting, cracks, and abnormal movements. Every effect caused by wind, vibrations, or the shifting of stone blocks was continuously monitored, allowing the construction team to detect danger before it was too late. They then moved on to protect the most important load-bearing points. The 28 external flying buttresses were supported by specially designed frameworks because each one had a different shape and level of damage. Inside, the stone vaults were inspected section by section to determine which areas remained stable and which required reinforcement before workers could venture deeper into the building. The missing roof was covered with a temporary structure to prevent rain, wind, and moisture from continuing to enter the interior. The debris was also handled slowly, with every fragment of stone, decorative element, and metal component classified, preserved, and assessed. Once Notre Dame had been temporarily stabilized, a major threat still remained overhead. The massive fire-damaged scaffolding twisted around the former location of the spire. Before the fire, the scaffolding had been erected for restoration work. After being exposed to intense heat for several hours, its metal bars had twisted, fused together, and formed a vast metal network hanging precariously above the missing roof. Workers had to suspend themselves from ropes high above the cathedral and cut through each metal bar in a predetermined sequence, while cranes waited outside to lift each section away from the structure. A single incorrect cut could cause an entire section of scaffolding to fall, dragging stone and weakened structural elements down with it. Only after the cathedral had been reinforced and the fire-damaged scaffolding safely removed was Notre Dame truly ready to enter the reconstruction phase. After the most dangerous parts of the construction site had been brought under control, France had to decide how Notre Dame would be restored. Although proposals had been made to replace the roof with glass or introduce a new architectural statement, France ultimately chose to rebuild Notre Dame almost exactly as it had been, restoring the cathedral's familiar appearance from before the fire. At the heart of this faithful restoration plan was the reconstruction of La Forêt, the forest of oak timbers once concealed beneath Notre Dame's lead roof. It formed the skeleton of the entire roof, where thousands of wooden components were joined together to bear the load and transfer forces down into the stone walls. When it was consumed by fire, Notre Dame lost a structural layer that had endured for centuries. To revive that forest, experts searched across France for oak trees of the right age, straightness, diameter, and grain. Nearly 1,200 trees were selected, each becoming a component with a specific size and purpose within the vast roof framework. The timber was then transported to carpentry workshops to be measured, marked, and shaped. Craftsmen used axes, chisels, and traditional tools to shape the beams along their natural grain, preserving their strength while recreating the spirit of the original framework. Before being raised onto the cathedral, the roof trusses were assembled on the ground for testing. Every joint was inspected, every angle adjusted, and every timber numbered. Once transported to Paris, all the components could be fitted together precisely like a giant skeleton prepared in advance. Finally, cranes lifted the roof trusses one by one, carrying them above the dense scaffolding before lowering them precisely onto the stone walls that had survived the flames. Workers aligned each component, inspected the joints, and assembled them into a unified framework. Day by day, the void carved out by the fire was gradually filled with new oak timbers. From the ground, a forest appeared to be rising once again above the Paris skyline, created from wood, craftsmanship, and the determination to restore Notre Dame to its familiar form. As the timber roof framework gradually took shape, the most symbolic element began to return: the spire of Notre Dame. It was more than a decorative feature. It formed a vertical axis rising from the cathedral's central crossing, where every thrust, compressive force, and load had to be calculated carefully to avoid placing additional pressure on the ancient stonework below. To rebuild this structure, the carpentry teams first had to construct its supporting base from oak. This component served as the foundation of the spire, securing the entire framework above and transferring its forces down to the main pillars. Each timber was cut, test-fitted, and numbered in the workshop before being transported to Paris and reassembled in the correct sequence. On the construction site, even the slightest deviation could prevent the joints from fitting together, so every lifting and positioning operation had to proceed slowly and precisely. Once the main framework was standing securely, the upper structural layers were installed one by one, recreating the familiar, slender outline of Notre Dame's spire. Seen from the ground, it resembled a needle of wood and metal being stitched back into the Paris skyline. Yet behind that graceful image lay a demanding challenge: how to reproduce its original form while ensuring resistance to wind, protection against water, and long-term stability. Around the timber framework, the lead roof was also restored to protect the building from rain, snow, and moisture. Lead sheets were shaped, joined, and secured across the roof, returning to Notre Dame the muted gray appearance that had blended with the Parisian sky for centuries. At the summit, the golden rooster also returned, resembling a small phoenix rising from the ashes. And when the spire was completed, Notre Dame regained more than a lost architectural element. It recovered the silhouette that had long embodied the soul of Paris. The revival of Notre Dame did not end with the spire rising above the Paris skyline. The journey also had to continue deep inside the stone walls, where light, sound, and sacred details had shaped the soul of the cathedral for centuries. The stone walls were carefully treated to remove the deposits left behind after the fire, restoring the interior to its original brightness. The stained glass required even more delicate work. Each window is a picture assembled from numerous small pieces of glass and secured within a lead framework. Therefore, Before cleaning began, experts had to determine when each window was created, how it had been repaired over time, and whether the painted layers on the glass were stable enough to withstand the restoration process. Cleaning tests were carried out with great caution. Under microscopes, experts examined the painted layers, the patina, and the deposits accumulated over time, from candle soot, dust, and human breath, to layers of pollution that had covered the glass for more than a century. A single method could not be applied to every window. Each one required its own treatment to remove the dirt without erasing the original artist's lines, colors, and handwork. The statues inside the cathedral were also cleaned, reinforced where damaged, and restored in detail, while preserving the traces of time on their original surfaces. One of the most remarkable tasks was the restoration of the great organ. Around 8,000 pipes had to be removed, cleaned, inspected, and returned to their correct positions. Lead, dust, and heat had not completely destroyed the instrument, but they had damaged it enough to require a quiet revival, carried out with meticulous attention to every tone. In December 2024, Notre-Dame reopened. That moment marked more than the completion of a construction project. It showed that light, music, and spiritual life had truly returned to the cathedral. Upon entering Notre Dame after its restoration, the first thing people notice is not an overwhelming sense of spectacle, but a very different kind of light. It glides through the tall windows, touches the rows of columns, spreads across the stone floor, and makes the interior seem as though it has awakened after years of sleeping behind scaffolding. Walls once covered in smoke and dust now appear in softer, brighter tones, revealing once again the graceful lines of Gothic architecture. The soaring vaults draw the viewer's gaze upward, where curves of stone intersect like fossilized branches. Looking up from below, one can clearly understand why medieval cathedrals always sought to lift people away from the earth, even if only through their gaze. Along both sides of the nave, rows of seating, passageways, religious artworks, and decorative details have been rearranged into a setting that feels solemn without becoming oppressive. The interior is brighter and more open, as though the ashes of the disaster have been lifted from the memory of the building. What is most remarkable is the feeling that the old and the new coexist. The stone still carries the appearance of centuries past, while the restored sections reveal the hand of the present age. There is no display of excess. There is no attempt to turn Notre Dame into a different building. After restoration, the cathedral's beauty lies precisely in that restraint, renewed enough to come back to life, yet quiet enough for visitors to still recognize the ancient soul of Paris. The return of Notre Dame is more than a triumph of construction engineering. It is also a reminder that some buildings do not exist through stone, wood, or stained glass alone, but through the memories of generations. For nearly 900 years, this cathedral has stood in the heart of Paris as a silent witness. It has watched the city change, wars pass by, bells ring during historic moments, and millions of people enter to pray, admire, or simply feel the weight of time. Therefore, when Notre Dame burned, people feared losing more than a monument. They feared losing part of their identity. The restoration demonstrated that heritage is not something motionless, confined to the past. It can continue to live only when people are willing to protect it, understand it, and pass it on using the methods of their own time. Sensors, cranes, digital scans, and modern safety procedures existed alongside axes, chisels, stone, oak, and the hands of craftsmen. Notre Dame therefore became a rare meeting point between the past and the present. A medieval structure was saved by 21st century technology without losing the soul that defined it. And that is the greatest value of this restoration. It did more than bring a cathedral back. It preserved a physical form for the memory of Paris. From the night of the fire in 2019 to the reopening in December 2024, Notre Dame underwent a journey shaped not only by engineering, but also by memory. Every stone that was preserved, every timber that was raised, and every pane of glass that was cleaned showed that restoring heritage is not about copying the past, but about finding a way for the past to continue living in the present. After everything it endured, Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris returned not as an untouched symbol that had never been damaged, but as a structure that had passed through fire and been revived through science, craftsmanship, and human patience. So, in your opinion, when a heritage site is destroyed, should we restore it exactly as it was, or allow it to bear the mark of the era that saved it? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow Mandarin Tech to discover more impressive engineering projects around the world.